everybody for coming. I promise I will make this talk at least somewhat salacious, but I also want to touch on some serious points about communicating science. I really did write a sex column, and it really was infamous. I wrote one every week for almost 3 years. And in that process, I learned a lot of things that I didn't already know about sex. And I also learned a lot of things about science writing. The reactions I got to that column really turned upside down the way I looked at things like science literacy and the way that the general public connects with science and scientists. I had been debating whether to make this talk about either sex or religion, and in the end I decided to focus on sex because when you write a column about sex for a general newspaper, you hear from religious people, and not all of them are very happy. But some of the things I heard from religious people as writing this column actually really surprised me, and I ended up learning quite a few things about religion as well.
But she needs that light. She needs the light, yeah.
Yeah, I have to read from something on that. Thank you. So how does a nice girl like me end up writing an infamous sex column? Well, it all started when I got a chance to work for the Philadelphia Enquirer, which is a big regional newspaper in Philadelphia. I had been doing science writing for various science-oriented publications, such as Science News and Science. And I was really excited to come to a big newspaper. I knew my story was going to reach a lot of people. But as I mentioned in, I think, my first talk, there was one thing that was kind of frustrating about working for a newspaper. And that was that, I'd turn in stories on things like cosmology and particle physics and evolution. And some of those stories got bounced back by editors, and they would say, well, this is fascinating, but you have to tell people why they should care about this. And I always thought that was kind of a double standard because, the sports writers don't have to tell people every time, like, why you should care about football. And the gossip columnists don't have to tell people why Lindsay Lohan's latest antics are important. So this was a little bit of a frustration. I started thinking, there's something that's a little bit incompatible between the front page newspaper format and often the way that science is done. I thought one way to deal with that would be to write a weekly column because, there are political columns and sports columns and business columns, and I thought, there really should be a weekly column devoted to science. And I spent a lot of time lobbying for this. After a while, everybody at the paper knew I really wanted a weekly column. And finally, an editor came along and said, okay, well, we'll give you a column, but we want it to be a sex column. And my first reaction was that was a really stupid idea, but I ended up doing it anyway. And the reason I ended up doing it was, well, on the upside, I had discussed this a lot with some of my writer friends, and they said, well, this will make you a better writer. And there was the opportunity to get syndicated. And I also thought that once I did this column for a while, that I would prove I was such a good column writer that the editors would see the light and give me the science column that I really wanted. On the downside, I realized that my parents were going to read this. Just the thought of my dad reading it made me very nervous. But we ended up starting the column, and we called it Carnal Knowledge. And the very first one I wrote started with a very basic question, which is, why is there sex? And it's actually not really obvious. The world got by with just asexual reproduction for many hundreds of millions of years, and lots of things are still asexual. If you depend on sex to reproduce, you can only pass down half your genes to your offspring, and there's a lot of energy and time spent in trying to find a mate or impress a mate, while asexual things can just reproduce all by themselves. So from a Darwinian viewpoint, it was actually kind of an interesting scientific question. So I'll read a little from the column I ended up writing about that. A while back, an article popped up in the Comcast homepage suggesting 10 things every single girl needs. including powdery high heels, CDs you hate but will make guys think you're cool, and a sexy picture of yourself to hang on your fridge to impress dates. Which made me wonder, how did this sex thing ever get started? Humans inherited sex from some ancestor deep in the history of life, but not from life's very beginning. For an idyllic billion-some-odd years, early life, which was single-celled, didn't need sex. You just copied your genes and divided in two. Why didn't all life stick with something so simple and efficient? Quote, "We don't have a definite answer," said Matthew Messelson, a molecular and cellular biologist at Harvard. "Scientists have about 20 competing theories, but don't know which one's right." So that column got into some of those theories. A lot of them dealt with the question of mutations, that if you're asexual, your descendants are all pretty much doomed to carry forth every bad mutation you have. But if you're sexual, you can pass on just half your genes, and some of them will be free from some of your bad mutations. And I learned something actually interesting from the discussions I had with friends and members of the public about this column. I actually talked about it a lot before it got written because it was my first one. And when I asked people in the public, what they thought about the origin of sex, and people would say, well, it's obvious that sex evolved because it's fun. And I thought, that's a really interesting answer because, sex evolved in things that don't have a brain or much of a nervous system. I thought, can sexually reproducing algae have fun? But I think that the fact that people assume that sex evolved because it's fun sort of reflects something about the way the general public sees evolution. They tend to see it as very human-centric and very teleological. And they tend to assume everything evolved for the good of the species. So this is how biologists see evolution. There's a big tree, and humans and animals in general on a really little twig. This is this is the picture non-scientists have when they think about evolution. And pretty much, everything, including the origin of sex, they imagine sort of happened somewhere in here. And it all happens for the good of the species. And the purpose of it all is to benefit this guy. And that actually got me thinking as a little aside about the fact that when we are sort of testing the science literacy of politicians and public figures, that the reporters often ask them whether they believe in evolution. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting choice of words, believe in, because we don't really ask people whether they believe in DNA or they believe in relativity, whether they believe in nuclear fission, but we ask people whether they believe in evolution. And I think the word kind of implies that evolution takes a leap of faith or takes as much magical thinking as believing in creationism. And I started to become a little concerned that it is possible that the way people understand evolution actually does. So that's just a little aside to throw out to ponder for the advocates of science literacy. But on to more salacious things. So my second column, let's see. Actually, I ended up writing well over 100 of these columns, and I found myself consulting not only with sex experts, but with all kinds of scientists, with evolutionary biologists, anthropologists, behavioral ecologists, various kinds of psychologists, sociologists, archaeologists, botanists, geneticists, paleontologists, ornithologists, ichthyologists, astrobiologists, philosophers, and historians. So we covered a lot of ground. And the first few columns are the ones that I remember best. This is my second column, which was about one of the more interesting manifestations of sexual selection in a creature known as the mosquito fish. And I'll read just a little of what I learned about the mosquito fish. Some would argue that bigger is better, but in some cases, being too well endowed can kill you. Take the lake-dwelling creature known as the mosquito fish. His penis can extend to 70% the length of his body, thereby interfering with his need to swim fast and escape deadly predators. How could such a thing evolve in a world ruled by survival of the fittest? Scientists are just starting to figure out the evolutionary force. Oh, wait a minute, I shouldn't skip that part. Okay. Let's see. Such mysteries explain why there's a whole field of science devoted to studies of the penis. It's an important field, said Brian Longerhans, a biologist at Washington University, St. Louis, who specializes in the male organ. For some reason, male genitalia exhibit a striking diversity of size and form, he said. Scientists are just starting to figure out what evolutionary forces give rise to this assortment, including the human one, which is apparently bigger than necessary. Form, in many cases, doesn't follow function. In the case of the mosquito fish, the male's generous equipment makes him irresistible to females, said Longerhans. The downside is that the organ creates drag in the water, making the most well-endowed mosquito fish easy pickings for predators. So I'll skip ahead to the experiment that this guy did. In the extreme case of the mosquito fish, Longerhans suspects it has to do with preference. To test his hypothesis, he put female fish in a tank and projected pictures of male mosquito fish on opposite sides. The pictures showed the same male, but in one, Longerhans extended the length of the penis by about 15%. The females checked out both and then swam straight for the longer one every time, he said. He published his findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That actually, I think, changed the way that people in the Enquirer newsroom pronounced the journal name PNAS. For I think there's still that. So some of the columns I dealt with things that people were talking about in the general public, but I would take a sort of an unusual natural history angle to them. So in one case, this was fairly early, that people were talking about a new drug that had come on the market that was supposed to make sex last longer for humans. And that got me thinking about why sex lasts as long as it does for us or any creature, and whether there's sort of adaptive advantages to it, either being really short or taking a long time. And I called some scientists, and I learned some very interesting things about that. Today, the average human male can stay engaged in sexual intercourse for 5 to 7 minutes. For better or worse, the advent of the new premature ejaculation drug, duloxetine, could bring that up to about 20 minutes. But even if that happens, human beings won't break any endurance records. The current record holder is the stick insect, said John Alcock, an evolutionary biologist from the University of Arizona. The stick insect can go on for several months, he said. It's not clear whether this is welcome to the female. The male stick insect plants himself on the female's back and attaches himself there. Luckily for her, the male is about half her size. While clearly encumbered, she can still go about her business. For many species, Alcock said, both sexes are quite capable of getting food while they are mating. I also, by popular request, wrote one of my early columns on the evolution of orgasms. And I learned from scientists that there were some obvious advantages for male animals. If a male animal isn't really getting that much out of what he's doing, he might get bored and stop before his mission is accomplished. And if he enjoys it too much, he might just keep going forever until he gets attacked by some predator. So it was helpful and advantageous to have some signal to tell him when he's finished. And there was actually a lot more debate and confusion about what the advantage was for females. And I found out that Stephen Jay Gould had actually written an infamous essay suggesting that in males this trait was adaptive and in females it was vestigial, or it was, he used to like to call things like that a spandrel. And the academic community kind of freaked out over this. They weren't very happy about it, not because it was a salacious topic, but more because I think it was kind of politically incorrect, that it was okay to think about the male body as having spandrels, but they weren't quite ready to think about that for the female body. But in any case, those people didn't freak out nearly as much as the people of Philadelphia did after these first few columns ran. I'd never really quite seen anything like it in their local newspaper. The columns ran on Mondays, and I would come into the office, and my phone would be like ringing off the hook, and there would be like 100 messages, and all my inbox was all full of email. And I classified the reactions into 3 basic types, and most of them were positive. People were like, this is great, it's different, and it's daring, and it's fun, and it's more interesting than most of the stuff in your science section, so that was good. And then some were not so happy. They said things like, I'm canceling my subscription, I can't believe the Enquirer is putting something in the paper that's pornographic. And then the ones that were angriest of all were actually people that told me that they thought from the title, Carnal Knowledge, that they had their hopes up that it would be pornographic, and they were really disappointed. So, but there was something that I actually learned about science writing from as well as I wrote these columns, and that was that I stopped getting questions from editors about why people should care, which I thought was very interesting. And I think some of that had to do with the fact that I was no longer doing traditional science reporting. I had entered a whole new realm. So instead of reporting on the latest paper, the latest breakthrough, I was taking questions that regular people would ask, things like, why is there sex, or why are there orgasms, or is possessiveness built into into some sort of evolutionary nature? And that way, I was kind of instead of bringing science to the mainstream, I was kind of bringing mainstream questions to scientists and challenging them to think about them. And there were all kinds of questions that started to emerge in my mind and the minds of my readers as we proceeded through this column. Here's one particularly interesting one that was based on a reader question I got and the surprising answer I found when I checked with scientists. Recently, a 33-year-old reader asked me to investigate his curious attraction to older women, much older, in their 70s or 80s. Varicose veins turned him on, he said. He's a big fan of, quote, granny porn. Well, interesting. Well, what's interesting about this geriatric fetish known as gerontophilia is not that it happens, but it's considered so extraordinary. We take for granted that men prefer young women, and that older women will buy all sorts of products to appear younger. Yet the youth premium doesn't apply to other creatures. A paper published in Current Biology reports that chimpanzee females grow sexier with age. Chimp males are natural gerontophiles. Boston University anthropologist Martin Muller and colleagues observed this pattern over many years following wild chimps in the Kavli National Park in Uganda. The finding makes sense, he says, if you know that chimps employ a completely different mating strategy than we humans. The females are not just promiscuous, they're almost frantically so. It looks like their primary goal is to mate with as many males as possible, Muller said. Then he goes on to explain this trait in chimps. And I also talked to biologists who looked at turtles. And they said, well, turtles are kind of indifferent. So if a 20-year turtle stumbles across a male turtle stumbles across a 100-year-old female turtle, he'll go after her with as much enthusiasm as he would a turtle of his own age. So they're not at all ageist.
Can the older female chimps still give birth?
Yes, they can. There's no, I think in reptiles there really is no menopause. They just keep going until they're done. In fact, they don't really age the same way. Reptiles are pretty interesting.
The
chimps. The chimps do give birth till about at the very end. So about 90% of their life they are fertile. Yeah, so that was another interesting thing. So I also learned quite a bit about, I missed a couple, didn't I? All right, there's a spandrel. Here we go, okay. I learned a lot about sex from discussing the sex lives of other kinds of animals. And I learned that evolution doesn't always guarantee that sex will necessarily be fun. Sometimes it can be dangerous and even deadly. Those are praying mantises. And somebody actually did a study and found that 80% of the diet of female praying mantises really does consist of the heads of male praying mantises. Very dangerous thing. And here's a column I wrote about the creature known as the giant squid. You don't want to mess with a giant squid, even if you yourself are a giant squid. Their embraces end with brutality, maiming, and sometimes death. And yet, in the darkest depths of the ocean, some irresistible force draws them together to procreate. When scientists from Japan released the first ever video of this elusive creature a few days ago, they gave but the smallest glimpse into its mysterious life. Until now, all we knew of the giant squid we learned from those washed ashore or caught on trawlers. Steve O'Shea, a giant squid expert from New Zealand, says males grow to about 30 feet, females to 40. They live in nearly total darkness several miles below the surface, where they probably spend most of their time eating, biting off hungry sperm whales, and having sex. From a human perspective, the sex part seems a little depraved and unpleasant. The male uses his penis like a hypodermic needle, piercing the skin on the female's arms, O'Shea said. With hydraulic force, he injects 4-inch-long tadpole-shaped spermatophores. They look like giant sperm, but really serve as sperm vehicles. Thousands of actual sperm wriggle inside them. The penis is about 5 feet long when flaccid. Quote, "I've never seen one erect, and I hope I never will," said O'Shea, who has been trying to gather a live giant squid for nearly a decade. Yes, this also shows that, some reporters are accused of trying to press scientists to give them certain types of quotes, but scientists will actually give you some pretty good quotes if you just let them talk about what they're interested in. Okay, a lot of readers. This was a popular question. A lot of readers asked me about sexual orientation in the natural world. And I ended up writing a column in which I discovered that there actually is a high percentage of homosexuality in sheep. And they gave me a great headline. Sometimes the copy editors are pretty clever. They called the column, "He's Just Not That Into You." And I'll just read a little tiny bit of this one. Over the past several weeks, the news media have explored every possible angle on the gay sheep herder movie Brokeback Mountain, except perhaps for the sex lives of the sheep. It actually leaves much to consider, because sheep research is beginning to offer some of the greatest new insights into the nature of homosexuality. This latest gay-themed film has prompted a flurry of pronouncements on blogs and other electronic forums that homosexual acts go against nature. When such rampant guessing about what is natural or unnatural starts infiltrating a cultural debate, it might be time to call a scientist. Scientists who spend lots of time watching animals have reported that dozens of creatures, from elk to elephants, climb onto same-sex partners. Killer whales and manatees engage in gay trysts while frolicking in the sea, and gay geese and ducks latch onto one another in devoted male-male and female-female partnerships. That one got quite a reaction from the readers as well. The headlines actually were always surprising to me, and the column got syndicated in a lot of other papers, and so they would get all kinds of different headlines, because each paper would write their own headline. I just was searching through some columns and found one I hadn't seen before. It says, "You only think self-mating sounds trouble-free." And I wasn't even sure what column that was. Something I wrote about parthenogenesis. So they could be very creative, some of those headline writers. There was a point where people were talking about astrobiology a lot and planets beyond the Earth, and I thought, it would be sort of interesting to ponder whether, if there was life on other planets, that sex was, inevitable, or whether it was sort of an unusual aspect of life on Earth. If there is life on other planets, would there be sex? Do we have to live on a freaky, sex-soaked planet, or is rampant sex normal and even inevitable for any life-supporting world? And I ended up, I always interview top-notch people for this one. I interviewed biologist Michael Lynch of the University of Indiana, and again, he talked about mutations and how life could really be limited. Asexual life could be limited by the fact that these mutations just keep propagating, and there's no way to get rid of them. And so it's possible that there's life out there that's asexual, but it might be limited in how interesting or complex it could become. Another question that I was interested in was the origin of the male and female sexes. because there can be sex without actually having males and females. And that got me to learn the universal definition of male and female, which is something I hadn't really thought about before. How would you universally define males and females in all life forms? And it turned out that the universal definition is that males make sperm and females make eggs. And so then you need a universal definition of sperm, and sperm are defined as the smaller of the two gametes and eggs as the bigger one. So that makes a very nice, totally universal definition. And from that, you can get all kinds of interesting things. Actually, when I wrote about that, here I started with a little bit from religion. The most familiar story explaining the origin of the two sexes comes from the Bible. God made Adam first and afterwards decided to create Eve from one of his ribs. All trouble then ensued from the secondary creation of women. Still, Genesis mixes several slightly different narratives, and woven into it is another less familiar passage that proposes a more simultaneous origin of the sexes. Male and female, he created them. That's really true. I actually, for my own cultural literacy, I took a course on the Bible as literature, and there really are these two separate narratives mixed in, but most people just know the rib story. Anyway, the male and female, he created them. That comes a little closer to the scientific worldview, though the science also tells us that men and women both evolved from other animals already divided into male and female. So there must have been a first male something and a first female something. What were they, and how did they come about? I think one of the rules I always tried to follow in writing this column was something that one of my science writing gurus told me a long time ago, which is never underestimate the intelligence of your readers, but never overestimate the knowledge they have in the subject that you're discussing. And I learned some really interesting things from that. That it turns out that one of the advantages of having sexes might be that the sperm don't bring any mitochondria, that all the mitochondria come from one parent, and that actually may help keep our mitochondria working for us and keep them from getting out of control. So there's some very interesting work in looking at the advantage of having just one parent bring the mitochondria to the offspring.
Did you ever write a column about why there aren't three sexes?
Yes, in fact, and there are some species that have mating types that have a whole bunch. And when you think about it, right, if you have just one sex, it doubles your chance of finding a mate, because then you can mate with anybody. And if you have more than one, it seems like having two would be the worst possible situation, because then you're really divided up. If you had 10 and you could mate with anybody but your own type, that would also be better. So I did discuss that, and I'm not sure I can't remember exactly what the leading answer is on that. But it may be just that it's ultimately it sort of comes about this way. That it's simpler. That having mating types can be complicated.
But maybe with two strands of DNA, maybe it makes sense. There's only two strands.
Yeah. There's kind of a complicated system for sorting it all out when you have 10 or more sexes. I think there are some that have just like hundreds of mating types. And so you can mate with any except your own. Kind of an interesting thing to ponder. Let's see, where am I? So I was also curious about what determines sex in what determines sort of who's male and who's female in different species. And I found that nature actually employs a lot of different systems besides the X and Y chromosomes that we mammals use. And in some species, it's determined by the temperature that eggs are exposed to, which can be a really vulnerable system in times of rapid climate change. And some species, actually, their sex isn't locked in when they're born. There are some fish that can transform in adulthood from female to male and male to female. And often what triggers those sex changes is their dominance position in their school. So as soon as the dominant fish dies, the next biggest fish will become dominant, but will also change sex. And they can go either way, depending on the species. And lots of animals use sex chromosomes, but evolved systems that are completely independent of ours. Birds have one where the males are homozygous, and the females are the ones with the two different kinds of sex chromosomes. And the platypus actually has 10 chromosomes, and there are a lot of people studying the platypus sex chromosomes because it may give some clue as to the origin of the mammal system and the bird system. I also was curious about monogamy in the natural world, and I learned that monogamous animals tend to have less sexual dimorphism. A lot of them actually look completely identical to outsiders, and some experts on penguins said that they couldn't tell the boy penguins from the girl penguins in some species, and they weren't really sure how the penguins did it. In fact, there might be some guesswork involved in that. So I said I would talk about religion, and I did learn a lot about religion during this column because I heard a lot from people. Some of them were creationists, and they were upset by the fact that this column was infused with evolution. And some were unhappy just because they said, you can't discuss this in a family newspaper. This is just not appropriate. You can't talk about these things. But some really were fans of the column, really liked it, and said it challenged their thinking. And I even had a number of religious people volunteer to be interviewed for a column I did on the way religious people viewed the biology of the virgin birth. I originally wanted to do this one at Christmas, but people thought that was too controversial. Darwin's evolution still stands out as the thorniest point of contention between science and religion, but other more recent scientific advances also raise new questions for believers. How, for example, does the 20th century biological revolution influence the Christian concept of virgin birth? Where did Jesus get his DNA? Or his Y chromosome? A number of scientifically minded Christians have come forward during the Dover Intelligent Design trial to say they accept that ordinary humans arose through purely natural processes. No intelligent design needed. But it's another thing to accept that our Lord and Savior was conceived through an act of sex. And the people I interviewed actually had a whole lot of different explanations for where this Y chromosome came from. Some were magical, but there was actually a Protestant theologian who said, well, he got it from Joseph. It was just biology. He said, the word for that was used in the Bible to describe Mary in the original Hebrew is Alma, which can be translated as virgin or as young woman. And so it's possible that it was all a mistranslation. I thought that was very, very interesting. So another thing I didn't know. Dealing with some of the religious objections to the columns actually gave me ideas for additional columns that would question things like why sex is so often judged in moral terms when the acts that people were objecting to never caused anybody any harm, and why there were double standards involving men and women and sexual orientation. So here are a couple of the questions, or a couple of the comments from readers that prompted whole new columns. I'm so disgusted by the filth you provide this paper. It's no wonder it's going down the drain. This is a disgrace. Shame on you. And then shame on you in all capitals with exclamation marks. Capitals. That prompted a column about shame. This one is from my voicemail. It says, Miss Flam, I've been meaning to call for about 2 weeks per your unintelligible column on unintelligible, comparing plastic shopping bags to the aggregates of sodomy, adultery, and bestiality. I don't know how you got this column, but I think you're non-compos mentis and you don't deserve a column. Bestiality, adultery, and sodomy are hideous sins. Which is funny because I didn't remember writing about any of those. I did write about the scientific controversies surrounding, or the possibility that our ancestors crossbred with Neanderthals. So maybe she considered that. I don't know whether that counts as bestiality or not. I didn't pass any judgment on them. That also led to a whole new column. For me, I found that the religious people and their reactions to the column, they were sort of divided into three types, and they didn't divide up the long traditional religious lines of Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim. They divided up more into the philosophy of these people. I mean, some were real fundamentalists. They were just very conservative thinkers, and they used their religion to back up prejudices that they had about what people should talk about in public and male and female roles and what they should be. And there was a lot of objection from those people to the idea that we could gain any insight into ourselves from animals, because they felt that animals have nothing to do. They're separate. We were created completely separately from animals. So just the implication that we're part of the animal world was offensive to them. And then there were a lot of people who I consider God of the gaps people. I didn't make up that term, but I think it's really good. It describes the way a lot of people think about science, that they take any question that hasn't been completely solved, like the origin of life or the origin of multicellularity that we've been discussing, and they say, well, that was divine intervention. That's proof that there was divine intervention. And that's really, I think that God of the gaps thinking is the foundation of the intelligent design movement, because the biologists that they used or that got involved in that were trying to find scientific questions that hadn't been answered yet, and then using that as proof of some supernatural interference in things. And some of the questions I think they originally brought up have been answered, so they have to keep looking for new ones. But in the end, I felt like it was kind of liberating to me and to a lot of readers to think about ourselves as products of evolution, not as products of this sort of magical teleological process, but as just plain old ordinary opportunistic evolution, and that the fact that our lives aren't perfect and our bodies aren't perfect and our relationships are imperfect and sometimes full of strife and conflict, that's all perfectly natural. And the other thing really was I found that this column was, I had to admit, as much as I didn't believe it at first, a lot more popular than any of the ordinary science articles I had written for the Enquirer. And I've thought about why that is. Some of it is that it really was, I really was starting with things that people were curious about. And I think that people are willing to do a certain amount of work to understand science when it engages their inherent curiosity. And also, I felt like I kind of spread out the work, that in this case I didn't make the readers do all the work of trying to understand a field that is difficult. Instead, I took some questions that were sort of unconventional and brought them to the scientists and made them do some of the work. And I did a lot of the work in trying to really think of how to express these ideas in common language. So it was kind of meeting people halfway. And I've tried to take that approach forward in the science column that I finally did get. Eventually I did this column, I wrote this column for almost 3 years, and then I stopped because I decided I really wanted a real science column, and I finally got one, which we called Kind of the Apes, that dealt with evolution. And I wrote that until I left the Enquirer, and then I have started a new project. It's an online column called Lightning Rod, and I meant to give these out in my earlier talks, but these cards have the URL and a little bit of information on how to keep up with Lightning Rod. So I hope that you'll take one of those. I also got a chance to turn the columns into a book, which was a lot of fun. It's called The Score: How the Quest for Sex Has Shaped the Modern Man, and maybe some of you will be interested in reading that. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions?
So you mentioned that one monkey species, the males are gerontophilic. Are also the females gerontophilic in that species?
I don't think the females care. I think in that case it was chimps, and the female chimps actually will mate with. They try to mate with as many males as possible, so they're promiscuous. They don't have a lot of preference. There actually are some speculations on why female chimps do that. Some of it has to do with infanticide, and they want to protect themselves, so they want their offspring. All the males think their offspring might be theirs. So that's one speculation on why they do that.
Cassandra?
So I like this second point here, and for sex, everyone's obsessed with it, and so that's sort of a set of things that you can take science with. How could you give an example of how, when you went back to your sort of real science column or your other science column, other questions that were sort of public questions that you brought to science to inform the science column that you really wanted to write?
Yeah, I think that evolution really has. There are lots of interesting questions about why we are the way we are that come from evolution. I wrote about the evolution all kinds of behavior. I wrote about the evolution of long-distance running for a column when there's a marathon, and I've written about why we have so many different kinds of dogs and they look so different. And so there were all kinds of things from sort of now I'm blanking. But they were always topics. They were often questions that people would ask as well. So once you start sort of interacting with the public that way, so I was able to actually the evolution column was just as popular, and some of it was starting with questions that people were curious about, or what that's a big debate right now. So there are so many things that you can take an evolutionary approach to.
Peter?
Oh yeah, I think it's absolutely brilliant that you did this, and your evolution column is equally brilliant. I'm wondering, can you do the same thing for physics?
I actually really would love to do a physics column because I think it would be challenging. I think it could be done because people actually. I did a couple of physics columns for the evolution column because one of the questions people kept asking was, all right, well, I'll accept that that things evolved and that people came from animals and that maybe even life came from molecules, but you can't have the universe come from nothing. That can't be. So there has to be a God that made the universe. And so I thought, well, that's really an interesting physics question to ask whether natural processes can start the universe. And so I wrote a couple of columns. That one is a big question, but you talk to cosmologists, because it happened this way, and this way of inflation. It's a little tricky, but it starts with a question. People want to know, how can these guys possibly think the universe started without divine intervention?
More questions? Yeah, please.
At some point you say that you wrote one of your columns about why either two sex and not three or one or something like that, right? Correct?
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, because I thought that one of the answers, at least, is it's a question of survival. What I mean is that when you have, the example of when people introduced rabbits in Australia, at the beginning of last century, and at some point they were just expanding like hell, and they had to kill all of them, and by putting the myxomatoes, you would say, the malady, okay, their illness, and then some of them survived, and it was interpreted as the fact that it was due to the diversity of the genetic package that they have, which is induced by the fact that having two sex indeed to create new genetic codes and so on.
Right.
And so I was wondering, is it indeed the kind of answers that you got from scientists, or?
Well, one thing that sort of was interesting about the origin of the sexes is that people talked about it almost like a cheater situation. Like you can't think of it as being good for the species. It's like if one individual, you have two sex cells of the same size, and one individual starts making little ones, then he can make a lot more, and they can move around and get around, and he can make a lot more copies of his offspring, and there you have a male. And then you can sort of get this. Then others will react to that. Others might be male, and yet if everybody makes little tiny gametes, then they come together. There aren't enough resources to make an offspring. So there's sort of everything is out for itself too. That there's you have to think of the way that individuals are competing against each other. And I think this issue with the mitochondria was also really important, that having this system where all the mitochondria, you need them, that they only come from one site, sort of actually is really important for eukaryotic cells, and keeping that mitochondria could actually start to compete. I think that was the idea, is if you bring in new combinations of mitochondria, they could compete with each other and start to evolve and might not remain in this great symbiotic relationship with the rest of the cell.
There are species where there are multiple sexes. It's just that they're rare.
Yes, like fungi can have a whole bunch.
I think there are some lizards also who have multiple.
I don't know lizards. Lizards can have there's sexual dimorphism in males. So there are lizards where there are like the males and females are different color. Like I think the females are yellow and the males are blue, but then some of the males are yellow, and then that gives them this huge advantage because they don't have to fight to be the alpha male. They just go in with the females and hang out.
You say that the universal definition of sperm and egg is that the sperm is the smaller one.
Yeah.
But to me, another very reasonable definition is that the sperm is the more mobile one.
Yes.
So is there a counterexample where these two definitions?
Where one is more mobile and is bigger? I don't think there is. That's a good question, though. I think that it'd be interesting to see if there is a counterexample. But I think in almost every case, it's the smaller one that moves around.
Oh, maybe I should ask Wikipedia, but since you're here, you said that the male orgasm was a signaling device. Tell the guy what
It might be. You know, people speculate on all these, and also there was a question that I never really got an answer to, which is where it started. You know, it didn't start in humans. I'm sure we inherited it from other things, but like, what kind of animal had the very first one? But I'm always so curious about that.
So
what it thought, you know.
The outrage about it being vestigal.
It's a little, yeah. It's kind of not such a big deal because it didn't start in us. I'm sure this was something that's probably independently evolved in different animals.
So we have like the Voldocene monologues.
Yes. Right. I like that. Uh-huh.
I'm thinking again about a question that normal people are interested in. And one of the things that I always struggle with is that a lot of these questions, the questions that people want to know, you know, I want to know too, and some I wonder about a little bit, are why questions. And I'm a very mechanistically driven scientist, and I don't think that science is equipped to answer questions about why things happen. And so, do you have any experiences or advice about effectively communicating to the public that, for example, this concept that orgasms evolved for this purpose or for that purpose are just hypotheses, and at the end of the day, if we think about an orgasm and we apply a teleological way of thinking to it, science can't help us with that.
That's a really important point, and I tried to get that across in this column, and even more in the evolution column, because by that point I was more sophisticated in my understanding of evolution when I was writing that. I think that's why it was a better column. But that, you know, that something can have an advantage, and that doesn't mean that it started that way. That it could be, you know, that different organisms use things. That evolution is incredibly opportunistic, and so what advantage the first animal that had this trait felt may be totally different from us, because we may use it in a different way. And so I do try to get that across. And I think that I agree with you about why questions, and I think how questions can be a lot more scientific and instructive. But sometimes you can take the why question and go to the how question, because the how question actually gives people a lot of information too.
Great. All right. Thank you, Faye.